Good morning. So it's Wednesday. Today we have Steve and Igor here to talk to us about the elephant, the deficit in the room. Before we get started, just so everybody knows, this is being recorded. And give you our fun little disclosure slide so you can see that for a second. And if you have questions throughout the webinar, just use your cursor to move at the bottom of the screen and the Q&A should pop up. And then you can type in your question and we'll take those again at the end of the webinar. And please take the time to answer the quick poll that should have popped up on your screen. And then once you've answered that, that'll go away. So with that, welcome again, and we'll go ahead and get started.
All right, so we're gonna go ahead and dive right in, talk about the deficit, debt, and what's the difference. But first, we need to understand what the federal budget is. So what is it? Well, the federal budget, simply put, is how much the United States government can spend any given year. So, well, it's an annual number. That's the first thing. The other important thing is it consists of two things. So the federal revenue, and what's that? It's taxes. So the primary source of revenue for the government is taxing its citizens. Now, the other part of the equation is the government expenditures, so the spending. And another way of looking at that is its obligations. So different types of endowments and whatnot. All of these things make up the federal budget. So if we look at it, the federal budget equals federal revenue, taxes and whatnot, minus government spending. So what happens if the deficit, or what happens if there's more obligations than there are taxes? What happens if there's more expenses than there's money coming in? Well, what do? You have a deficit. And a deficit means you have to borrow. So, in other words, to make the federal budget even out, you have to do some borrowing, add that to your revenue so that that evens out. And when you have the deficit, which is an annual figure, repeated over and over again, well, that's how you get debt. Debt is just the deficit repeated over and over and over again. So with that being said, let's look at an example of this. Rachel, can you please show us how the federal budget looked in 2019? So first thing you can see is that there's really two primary drivers for the budget. The 4.4 trillion total budget, half of that was Social Security and Medicare. That made up 2.2 trillion. The other, just different types of programs, endowments and whatnot. And on the other revenue side, we see that we have taxes from individual, Social Security taxes, and the rest, the 80% of that is great enough. The 20% is what we needed to borrow. So in 2019, a normal year, we still had to borrow almost $1 trillion to have these two even out. So
yeah, so that's a great explainer, Igor. Thanks for going through that. I think sometimes we kind of lose sight of what those different terms really mean. So yeah, that $960 billion number in a normal year is quite a big jump. It's quite a big leap when you think about it from just a number standpoint. And I think about if my wife came home with a $960 credit card, $1 billion credit card bill, I'd be pretty upset with her. But when you look at it from that standpoint, a lot of people think about the debt in terms of a household, and that is an okay way to look at it if you're a citizen. Because if you're a citizen, you have your assets, whether that's your house or your car or a couch or a TV, things that you own, and you also have your debt, and you have your own budget that you have to kind of balance every year. The government, on the other hand, they have the debt, which we hear about and is talked about on the news all the time, but we don't really hear about the asset side of the equation. The federal government has lots of land, they have lots of oil and gold and financial assets that all equal out to about 200 trillion of assets. Now, I'm not saying, in a normal situation where a citizen might sell their TV to make their budget work. I don't think the United States government, we want them to sell a part of Yellowstone. You know, Igor, you know, even though he wants to buy Half Dome, you know, I don't think you really want he could.
Us Russians won Alaska back instead.
So, but it's one of those things that if you're going to think about it as a household kind of issue, you have to take those assets, the asset side of the balance sheet into it to factor in. The other thing that, you know, you as a citizen have is the ability to hopefully, you know, you could go to your boss and you could say, could I get a raise? Or you could go to the Social Security Administration and say, could I get a raise? And they'll tell you no. The boss might, yeah, the boss might tell you yes. He might give you a raise, or you might get a second job, but you really have a limited, you know, scope of how much money that you can bring in. The federal government, on the other hand, has the ability to tax its citizens, you know, at any time. They can change the law that says, oh, today the tax rate is 37% for the highest, you know, the highest bracket, and they can make it 45. They can make it 50. I don't think it's very politically, it's not a really great way politically to move forward with your career as a politician, but it is something that they can do. So you have to take those two factors into account when you're looking at the federal debt and what it really means to the country.
Right, so kind of to recap on that, we can either decrease our expenses or increase our revenue. And it's funny, we had a poll actually about this on Monday. If you tuned into the tax seminar, you were asked this: would you want to pay higher taxes if it goes toward the deficit? And what was the result?
I think we had 95% say that they would not want to pay higher taxes.
So thank you. There we go. It's because of you people we have a problem.
But there were two really, you know, genuine souls who wanted to pay higher taxes to help the federal government. So thank you for you two.
So if that's how a normal year of spending looked like, 2019, well, Rachel, let's see how 2020 looked like and compare the two together. So the first thing, right off the bat, you'll see that the big difference is in how much the federal budget was. So the federal budget for 2020 increased to, you know, it increased 50%. It went from 4.4 trillion to 6.6. That's a 2.2 trillion increase. Yet most people, when they have less income, the revenues actually the government had, the taxes, that fell by about 9%. So not only did the amount of money we have coming in go down, but now we had to essentially increase our expenses. What did we do? We borrowed more. So we had to borrow 50%. So our revenues and all of our incomes together was enough to take on about half of our obligations. The rest, that had to be borrowed. So is that, well, part of that is it a bad thing? Is borrowing a bad thing? And well, it depends. Yes, it is. Thank you for tuning in, everybody, and we'll catch you tomorrow. So well, it depends. It depends on whether or not the debt is manageable and if it's serviceable. If it is, well, that's a good thing, because you can see that you don't have to pay as much to maintain that level of debt, essentially. So back to looking at the chart we just looked at, if you noticed, and it's a small bar, so it's a little hard to notice, but the interest expense in 2020 actually fell by 10%, almost 10%, meaning that even though our debt went up by 240%, we had to pay 10% less on that debt. So that's what makes debt, albeit bad, sustainable or manageable. And that's one of the major factors that plays a big role. Another thing is it's good for some individuals, like not only the government, it's good for people who have a mortgage and perhaps they want to refi. Actually, Diana wrote an article about that on LinkedIn not long ago. If you want to check it out, it has some useful tips. But those are the winners of the equation. So that's what makes the debt sustainable. On the other hand, you have savers. A lot of you watching now, you may be approaching retirement, or you may be already in retirement, and your portfolio assets to live off of. And a big part of that is asset allocation. So with low interest rates, you're not getting as much of a yield from fixed and securities, bonds, CDs, and whatnot. In fact, Rachel, if you want to show them how CDs looked 20 years ago and compared to how they look now, well, now you're lucky to get 0.5%. Back then, 5%, no problem. So what that really says is that you don't need to take too much risk. You don't need to take too much exposure to equities to get a good return to live off of. You can have your cash earning a lot in CDs and not take much risk. So in fact, looking at that example, Rachel, if you want to show how the year 2000 looked like, if you wanted to get 6% return, that's an average, arbitrary number. And let's just say for simplicity, the S&P gave a 10% yield every year, and CDs paid about 5%. How much would you need to invest stocks to bonds to get that 6% return? Well, you'd only need about 15% of your money invested in equities. That's really the risk part here in the equation. The rest could comfortably sit in CDs and not have too much. You'd sleep well at night. You wouldn't be taking too much risk. And if we look at that 6% return number that the chart to the right-hand side shows, well, what is that comprised of? So bonds, in this case, or CDs, they would have gotten you 4.7% or so, roughly speaking. And the rest, 1.3%, would have come from the 15% that's invested in stocks. In other words, stocks contributed to the return of the portfolio, but not as much. Bonds did most of the work because they were mostly bonds in the portfolio to begin with. That's not the case in 2020. Rachel, if you could show them how 2020 looks like, you'll see that 15% to stocks is no longer the case. If you wanted to get a 6% return on your portfolio, you'd have to invest something like closer to 60%, and the rest would be the bonds. And perhaps most interestingly is that the 60% invested in stocks is responsible for almost all the gains. So about 5.9% of the 6% return would come from stocks, yet you only invest 60%. The other 40% in CDs and whatnot, that's not so much a revenue generating, that's not so much appreciating asset, it's so much to keep you essentially balanced out. It's kind of helps as a cushion between the fluctuations of the market.
Yeah. And that's a question that we get from a lot of clients is, when is the debt going to affect me? And Igor did a great job there explaining how it already has affected you. It's affected you in low interest rates, which cause you to have to take more risk in your portfolios to get the same amount of return. I think it's also affected just the government in general, the growth of the nation in general has been affected by how much we have to pay to service that debt and how much we have to borrow to get that debt. So, that's a great job of kind of showing, yeah, it has affected you already, whether you feel it or not. You might not have felt it over the last 10 years because stocks have done so great. But, we are feeling it in different ways. But I think when we get that question, when will this affect me? What you're really asking is, when am I going to have to pay higher taxes, or when is the government going to have to cut their spending? And I wish we had that crystal ball that could tell us, hey, it's 10 years from now or 20 years from now. But the challenge is there's so many dynamics at play in terms of, well, when is it politically viable for someone to come out and say, hey, we need to cut spending, or we need to raise taxes to do that. It's going to be a really long road to get to there. And as Igor said, with interest rates so low, we don't have to pay as much on, even though it's a very large number. We're actually paying less than we were even last year or the year before that. So, there's going to come a time politically when it's going to have to happen. And there's a great Churchill quote that, America will exhaust all of their options until they do the right thing. And I think that's what's going on right now. The politicians are deciding to kick the can as many times as they can down the road to see who's going to actually take up the mantle and say, hey, we need to address this. And it's going to come in probably both forms. It's going to come in spending cuts, whether that's from Social Security or defense or non-defense or however it is. It's going to come from that side, and it's going to come from higher taxes. So even the 95% of our clients who said they would not want to pay higher taxes, maybe you won't have to, but your kids will, or me and Igor will. But there's going to come a time when we're going to have to pay higher taxes to balance that out. So, and that's why we do what we do. We build financial plans to move you into the next phase of your life and say, look, does your plan say that you have to take more risk? If it doesn't, that's great. You can sleep well at night. But if interest rates are low and your plan is saying you need X% return, and we're going to have to stretch out, we're going to have to take on more risk to get you for that plan to work, it's really important that you have that plan so that you know, hey, I've got to take this risk, because it's better to know going into it, hey, I've got to put 40% into stocks, or I've got to put 80% into stocks to make this work. I'd rather know that beforehand than when it's too late.
Right. And to that point, we always, when we build out financial plans, you'll notice there's a theme. We underestimate the growth and we overestimate other things like expenses and whatnot. And at the end, we get a reasonable number to base our returns, because we can't control returns. We can only control the planning part of the aspect.
All right. Did we have any questions, Rachel?
Yeah.
Ask away.
Yeah, so if you guys have some questions, feel free to start typing them into the box and sending them our way. But one question that's come up, what's the point of negative interest rates, and how does that affect the countries that have them?
So the U.S., so to repeat the question, how do negative interest rates affect an economy, and is the U.S. likely to follow the suit of some European and other countries in general? Two-part answer. So first of all, negative rates are simply another way for the central banks to encourage money circulating in an economy and reducing the amount of savers that there are, because it makes saving less profitable or less rewarded. So you have to take some risk. You have to put that money and circulate it back into the economy. Now, the United States being a world reserve currency is a little bit of a different comparison. It's not so much apples to apples anymore, because the United States is a little bit more secure. So that's why we can afford to essentially have some yield on our fixed securities as opposed to other countries. And frankly, a lot of those foreign investors came and bought U.S. treasuries and U.S. securities to offset their own sovereign low-yielding debt, and that's part of the answer. So I don't think U.S. is heading in that direction yet. I think this situation's fundamentally a little bit different economically speaking, with the U.S. being a reserve of the world, the currency reserve of the world. But it is definitely a new development, to say the least.
Yeah, and I'd also say that, you know, the federal government, especially because of who votes in our country, probably does not want to hurt savers that much. I mean, we've already hurt them quite a bit by lowering interest rates to as low as they are. You know, it obviously is helping borrowers. I've refied. I think most of the people in our office have refied their houses, and we encourage everyone to refi their house if they have a higher interest rate. So but I really think politically it's a difficult step to go to say, yeah, we're going to go to negative interest rates.
And then the next question, so what about Japan's situation and their debt to GDP ratio and how it's hindered their growth? Could that happen to the U.S.? And maybe you want to explain a little bit about what's going on in Japan.
Yeah, sure. So, you know, for about 30 years, Japan's stock market really hasn't gone anywhere, and they've had low interest rates really for 30 years. And I think the reason that the United States won't follow the Japan kind of example is that we have a completely different economy and a completely different demographic situation. Japan has a lot of older people. They have a stagnant kind of workforce, and they don't have that productivity that the United States has. And then on top of that, we just have a completely different stock market makeup than Japan has. So the other thing I think is, I don't think any government official would want to get to that same place in terms of debt to GDP. You know, their debt to GDP is over 200%. We're just below 100, right on that cusp of 100 right now. And I think we would address that far sooner than Japan ever did. And I think they're just kind of in a perpetual cycle where they just can't get out of that debt. They don't have the ability to tax enough people because of their demographic issues, whereas the United States would have that capacity because we have so many millennials and Generation Z and all the
immigration too.
That's true, and we have more immigration than Japan has as well. So we have a lot more of a dynamic economy that could, and like I said, I really think we would address that situation prior to. I don't know when again, back to the crystal ball, I don't know when that will be addressed, but I think taxes will, you know, we will implement those taxes to stave off going into that.
And the economy itself structurally is different with Japan and the United States. Back when Japan was a powerhouse and their markets were reaching new highs, well, it was kind of an industrial revolution, times where the economy was different. Now it's shifted toward tech and growth, and that's where the U.S. dominates. So I think just now, it's Japan is coming back to where their highs were, roughly speaking, 30 years ago.
Yeah. So finally.
Wow, 30 years.
30 years. Yeah.
So another question, what will you do differently in portfolios when interest rates go up?
Yeah, that's a good question. For right now, we don't see interest rates moving higher, for the foreseeable future. But when they do, in that case, you probably want to have less exposure to fixed income heading into that situation. But then once, they kind of moderate, it would be, better to kind of go back to your plan. I mean, it really is, that's an individual question that depends on, that person. The other thing we can do when interest rates rise is be in different fixed income securities that benefit in that situation. Instead of being in treasuries or things like that, you can be in corporate debt or high yielding debt that will have more of a chance of doing well in that situation. They probably still won't. They probably will still, bounce around and be negative only because of that dynamic of interest rates rising. But it's one of those things that we can shift portfolios in the meantime if we think that interest rates are going to rise, to take advantage of that. And then once they've settled in at a spot, then we come back to the plan and say, okay, well, now where is the equilibrium of what you need stock to bond wise to get you to the plan to the end of the road?
Yeah, that's something we discuss weekly. We meet every week and we talk about what's happening with the market and the economies, as well as what changes we should make. But to answer the question, it really always comes down to the individual level and how it fits your plan. If you're in your 20s, nothing. We're going to still invest in stocks pretty heavily because that's more likely than not, or could be the right thing to do with a long time frame. But it always depends on your plan and your specific situation.
Yeah.
Okay. How might the deficit be impacted by coronavirus relief efforts or the stimulus?
Yeah, I mean, you already saw that in the 2020 budget, and there probably will be another stimulus package heading into next year. So I would say that, in a normal year, if we're running at about $1 trillion of borrowing, I would say maybe next year, hopefully it goes down from this year. But we're probably still going to face, in that $2 trillion range of debt. So, we are stacking debt on top of debt. So the deficit is going to continue to roll over. But again, at the low interest rates that we have right now, is that an issue? Yes, it's an issue because eventually it's going to have to be addressed. But at the specific moment, it might not be.
Just less expensive to borrow.
That's right. Yeah.
So the first question, what was cash paying in the 1980s?
Yeah. And most everyone got that one right. It was the 13.5. And the issue becomes, well, what was inflation during that time as well? So even though you were earning 13.5 on your cash, you were actually only getting about maybe 2% because inflation was running at 10, 11%.
Still a lot better than today.
It's still better
a lot better than today.
For sure.
All right, and the second one, on your guys' individual screens, you'll be able to scroll down to see all the results. But what is the total deficit for 2020?
And luckily, we had that in the presentation, so half of you saw that, and maybe the other half didn't wait until the presentation had come up. But yes, it was 3.3 trillion. We would probably expect another 2 trillion or so next year. So yes, the debt is growing, and it will have to be addressed at some point. But we're hopeful that 2021 will be a good year for
less than 50% borrowing. It would be nice. And that plays another role too with the COVID question is, well, how is COVID going to impact it? We saw that COVID partially impacted it with less people working means less tax revenue for the government. Obligation, and to a degree, remained unchanged. Yeah. So that's also another dynamic with loss of jobs, and there's loss of revenue for the government. That means they have to not only supplement more and spend much, but they have less money to do it with. So that's also another factor.
Awesome.
That's all the questions we have.
Terrific. All right, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. Join us tomorrow. Me and Rachel will be talking about investment strategies under a Biden presidency. So please join us tomorrow. And Friday, we'll have Good News Friday. So we won't have to talk about any of this stuff. It'll all be good news. So please join us tomorrow and Friday.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Take care.
Take care.